The chill was the first thing Elara knew, a gnawing cold that seeped from the stone floor of the servants' dormitory, through her thin straw pallet, and into her very bones. It was a companion more constant than any human in Blackwood Castle. She sat up, the rough spun wool of her kirtle, her only dress, scratching against her skin. It smelled, as she did, of wood smoke, damp, and the faint, lingering aroma of yesterday's despair. Through the narrow arrow-slit window, the sky was a deep, bruised indigo, the stars still sharp in the blackness. Dawn was a promise, not yet a certainty. At 16, Elara had known no other life. Her mother, a laundress, had succumbed to a lung fever born of life fumes and river damp when Elara was barely old enough to haul her own small bucket. Her father, a forgotten man-at-arms, had vanished into the mists of some border skirmish even earlier. Elara was a creature of the castle's underbelly, absorbed into the scullery's ceaseless toil from the moment her small hands could grip a scrubbing brush. The faint, silvery scar that traced a crescent across her left cheekbone was a memento from those early days, a stumble near the great kitchen hearth, a falling brand, a lesson in the castle's casual dangers. She rose, her joints stiff, her feet finding the icy flagstones with a familiar reluctance. Around her, other shadows stirred, groaned, coughed, the chorus of Blackwood's lowest order awakening to another day of servitude. No words were spoken. Breath was too precious to waste on pleasantries in the cold air. Her path to the kitchens was a descent into a familiar inferno of noise and heat, a stark contrast to the dormitory's chill. Even before she reached the kitchen proper, a commotion snagged her attention. Under Steward Thorne, a man whose thin lips seemed perpetually pursed in a sneer, was berating a stable lad near the main entrance. The lad, no older than 10, cowered as Thorne's voice. A low, venomous hiss, flayed him for some imagined slight, a speck of mud on Thorne's boot, perhaps, or an insufficiently bowed head. "Do you imagine Lord Uhtred pays me to suffer the incompetence of stable filth?" Thorne's hand lashed out, a sharp crack against the boy's ear that sent him stumbling. The wart beside Thorne's nostril, an ugly purple nub, twitched with his agitation. Elara's stomach clenched. Thorne was a weasel in slightly better clothes, his minor authority a weapon he wielded with relish against those who could not retaliate. She made herself smaller, a trick learned through years of harsh lessons, and scurried past. The boy's stifled sob a bitter taste in her mouth. This was Blackwood, a place where cruelty was as common as cold draughts. "Elara, girl," Cook Agnes's voice, a force of nature that could curdle milk at 50 paces, erupted from the kitchen's smoky depths. "Are ye daft or deaf? The hearth fire's dying. And the trenchers from last night look like a pig's been at water, now." "Yes, cook." Elara's reply was automatic, her body already moving towards the great oak buckets. Another day had begun. Current part characters, 3250. Total characters, 3250. The scullery was Elara's purgatory, a damp, ill-lit chamber off the main kitchen where the ghosts of countless meals lingered in the greasy film on the walls and the ever-present stench of congealed fat and soured wine. Here, the detritus of noble feasting, mountains of pewter plates, iron pots caked with burnt offerings, sticky goblets, awaited her penance. Soap was a distant rumor. Her tools were coarse sand, sharp-edged ashes, and the burning kiss of lye water. Her hands, though she was but 16, were a road-map of her toil, reddened, swollen, the skin split in a dozen places, grime ground so deep into the cracks that it had become part of her. Thomas worked beside her, a gaunt figure a few years her senior, his shoulders already bowed with the weight of premature old age. His contribution to the scullery's symphony was a persistent, hacking cough that tore at his lungs. A sound as regular as the drip of water from the leaky roof. They rarely spoke. Words were an extravagance, and what was there to say that the shared misery had not already articulated? Yet, Sometimes, their eyes would meet over a particularly stubborn patch of grease, or when Cook Agnes's temper flared with unusual ferocity, a fleeting acknowledgement, a spark of shared endurance in the gloom. The memory of Thorn's morning cruelty lingered with Alara, a sour taste at the back of her throat. It was the casualness of it, the assumption of power, that chilled her most. She was no stranger to harshness. Cook Agnes's spoon was quick to punish, and hunger was a constant companion, but Thorn's malice felt different, colder, more personal. She thought of her mother, coughing her life away amidst the reek of boiling linen and harsh lie, a life consumed by thankless labor. This was the legacy bequeathed to her. A birthright of servitude in a world that saw her as less than the dogs that begged for scraps at the high table. The hours crawled by, measured in aching muscles and the growing emptiness in her belly. A heel of stale bread, hoarded from the previous evening's scant meal, was all she had to sustain her until the watery pottage served after the nobles had dined. She ate it in furtive bites, tucked away behind a stack of firewood, each dry mouthful a small, defiant act against the hunger that was her constant shadow. As twilight began to stain the grimy scullery window with shades of bruised plum and old blood, Cook Agnes's voice echoed again. "Alara, slops, and mind you do not spill a drop in the courtyard, or you will lick it clean yourself." Dragging the heavy wooden buckets filled with the day's refuse, vegetable peelings, gnawed bones, rancid cooking fats, and the unidentified muck that accumulated in a place of such relentless consumption, was one of Alara's least favored tasks. The stench was a physical assault, clinging to her hair and clothes, a perfume of decay she carried with her always. The path to the midden heap, a festering mound behind the castle's outer bailey, was treacherous in the fading light, slick with mud and the organic detritus of Blackwood's daily life. The air hung thick and cloying. As she wrestled with a particularly heavy bucket, tipping its foul contents onto the steaming pile, her foot slipped on something unseen. She stumbled, catching herself just before she fell headlong into the mire. Annoyed, she kicked at the offending lump. It shifted, and a faint glint of something unnatural caught her eye amidst the vegetable peelings and straw. Curiosity, a rare and often perilous emotion for one in her position, overcame her ingrained caution. She glanced around. The courtyard was deserted, shrouded in the deepening twilight. Using the toe of her worn, ill-fitting leather shoe, she prodded at the object, dislodging a clump of rotting turnip. There, nestled in the filth like a fallen star, lay a small, silver locket. Current part characters, 4,000. Total characters, 7250. Alara's breath hitched. Her heart gave a painful thud against her ribs. It was intricately wrought, heart-shaped, its surface chased with delicate, swirling patterns of ivy leaves that gleamed even through the clinging grime. This was no common trinket, no servant's bauble. This was an object of quality, of value. This belonged to a noble. Her first, overwhelming instinct was raw, visceral fear. To be found with such an item in her possession would be tantamount to a death sentence, or at least, a sentence that would make her wish for death. Accusations of theft, a swift and brutal flogging in the castle courtyard, perhaps the loss of her hands. The possibilities, each more horrifying than the last, paraded through her mind. Yet, even as fear clawed at her throat, a strange fascination held her captive. It was beautiful. Impossibly beautiful. A tiny island of artistry and light in her world of unrelenting ugliness. An almost forgotten part of her, the part that still remembered her mother's rare smiles or the fleeting warmth of the sun on a spring morning, yearned for it. Could she keep it? The thought was madness, a moth fluttering too close to a candle flame. Where would she hide it? Her worldly possessions consisted of the clothes on her back, a threadbare blanket that offered little comfort against the dormitory's chill, and a small, smooth river stone she kept as a memento of a day, years ago, when she had briefly escaped the castle walls and seen the river flowing free. A distant sound, the mournful groan of the great portcullis being lowered for the night, shattered her paralysis. Time was running out. She had to decide. With a sudden, desperate resolve, she snatched up the locket. Its cool metal felt alien against her calloused palm, surprisingly heavy. Wiping it furtively on a relatively clean patch of her kirtle, she thrust it deep into the inner fold of her sleeve, the unexpected cold of the silver a shocking sensation against her skin. Her heart hammered a wild tattoo, a drumbeat of terror and a strange, illicit excitement. The journey back to the scullery was a gauntlet of imagined eyes and accusing whispers. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into the shape of Thorn or one of his cronies. Every creak of the castle's ancient timbers sounded like an approaching footstep, a summons to judgment. She emptied the remaining slop buckets with trembling hands. Her movements jerky and uncoordinated. Cook Agnes, embroiled in a heated dispute with one of the under-cooks over the proper seasoning for the Lord's venison stew, fortunately paid her no mind. Later, cocooned in the suffocating darkness of the servants' dormitory, Elara lay on her pallet, every nerve ending screaming. The air was thick with the snores, coughs, and muttered sleep talk of her fellow unfortunates, a symphony of shared misery. But Elara was a world away, acutely aware of the small, hard object pressed against her arm. Carefully, silently, she retrieved her river stone from its usual hiding place, a loose piece of mortar in the damp stone wall beside her sleeping space. With fingers that still shook, she worked the silver locket into the narrow crevice behind the stone, then pushed the stone firmly back into place. It was a flimsy concealment, a child's hiding spot, but it was all she had. Sleep, when it finally claimed her, was a troubled landscape of shadows and whispers, haunted by the cold, accusing gleam of silver. Current part characters, 3840. Total characters, 11090. The following morning, the castle air was not filled with the usual aromas of baking bread and roasting meat, but with a palpable tension, a current of hushed, anxious whispers that eddied through the lower corridors and service areas like a foul miasma. Lady Annalise, Lord Uhtred's young niece, a recent arrival from a more genteel southern estate, had lost a silver locket. It was, the gossipmongers whispered with a mixture of awe and fear, a gift of great sentimental value, bestowed upon her by her betrothed, a knight of some renown. Lady Annalise was said to be prostrate with grief, her delicate southern sensibilities shattered by the loss. Lord Uhtred, a man whose temper was notoriously short and whose tolerance for any disruption to his well-ordered household was virtually non-existent, was reportedly incandescent with rage. And, as Elara learned with a fresh surge of icy dread that threatened to curdle the watery gruel in her stomach, under Steward Thorn had been personally entrusted with the locket's recovery. Thorn, who thrived on the fear of others as a bloated tick thrives on blood, seized upon his new authority with a malevolent glee. He saw it not merely as an opportunity to ingratiate himself with his lord, but as a divine license to unleash his petty tyrannies upon the castle's most vulnerable inhabitants. His usual sneer was amplified, his voice, already adept at conveying disdain, now dripped with the honeyed venom of power. A silver locket of considerable value has disappeared, he announced later that morning, addressing the assembled kitchen staff. His small, close-set eyes, like chips of obsidian, raked across their pale, anxious faces, lingering for a moment too long on Elara. She dropped her gaze to the greasy flagstones, her heart a frantic, trapped bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Lady Annalise is inconsolable. Lord Uhtred is displeased. He expects its immediate return. Should anyone be found to be concealing this item, or to possess knowledge of its whereabouts and fail to divulge it, they will face the gravest consequences. He paused, allowing the unspoken threat to hang in the smoky air, heavy and suffocating. There will, of course, be thorough searches. The searches commenced that very afternoon. Thorn, flanked by two hulking men at arms whose expressions suggested they would happily dismember a kitten for sport, began his systematic ransacking of the servants' meager quarters and possessions. Straw pallets were contemptuously kicked aside, threadbare blankets shaken out with unnecessary violence. Pitifully small hoards of a saved crust or a shiny button exposed to ridicule and, often, arbitrary confiscation. Elara watched, her insides a knot of cold dread. As Thorn and his thugs approached her own designated sleeping space against the damp north wall of the dormitory, she had, at the first glimmer of dawn, her fingers clumsy with fear, checked her hiding spot. The locket was still there, its silver presence a cold, guilty secret behind the familiar gray of her river stone. Thorn's boot connected with her pallet, sending wisps of straw flying. He ran a dismissive hand over her thin, patched blanket. His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the damp, uneven stones of the wall. Elara held her breath, a silent prayer caught in her throat, a prayer to a god she suspected had long since turned a deaf ear to the pleas of scullery maids. For a heart-stopping, eternity-long moment, his gaze seemed to hesitate on the slightly discolored patch of mortar around her river stone. Then, with a grunt of dissatisfaction, he moved on. His attention diverted by a frightened squeak from a nearby laundry girl whose cherished, albeit crudely carved, wooden bird he had just deliberately snapped in two. Elara let out her breath in a ragged, silent gasp, relief so potent it threatened to buckle her knees. She had survived the first pass. But she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Thorn was far from finished. His eyes, as he left the dormitory, had held a promise of further torment. The locket, her beautiful, terrible secret, felt like a lead weight in the pit of her stomach. Current part characters, 4652. Total characters, 15742. Days crawled by, each one a fresh turn of the screw in Elara's private torture. Thorn's investigation, if such a campaign of bullying and intimidation could be dignified with the term, continued with unrelenting zeal. He seemed to relish his power, his ability to disrupt lives and spread fear. The locket remained undiscovered, and Thorn's frustration grew, making him even more unpredictable, more dangerous. He developed a particular fixation on Elara. Perhaps it was her very quietness, her tendency to shrink from his gaze, that he misinterpreted as guilt or defiance. Or perhaps, in his petty cruelty, he simply found her an easy, unresisting target for his spite. He would often appear in the scullery unannounced, his sudden presence causing Elara's heart to leap into her throat. He would stand there, arms crossed, the wart beside his nostril twitching, simply watching her as she scrubbed at the endless piles of greasy pots, his silence more unnerving than any shouted accusation. He would overturn buckets, inspect her already raw hands for signs of hidden wealth, his breath reeking of stale wine and something sour. Thomas, too, bore the brunt of Thorn's escalating malevolence. The under-steward appeared to have singled him out, perhaps because Thomas, despite his physical frailty, possessed a core of quiet resilience that Thorn found infuriating. Thorn would assign Thomas the most repulsive tasks, cleaning out the blocked drains from the slaughterhouse, shifting piles of dung from the stables in the pouring rain, finding fault with his most diligent efforts, accompanying his criticisms with a cuff to the head or a kick to the shins. Elara watched these daily torments with a growing sense of helpless anger and a gnawing guilt. Was her secret, the locket hidden behind the river stone, somehow responsible for Thomas's increased suffering? The thought was a constant, bitter companion. One afternoon, driven by a shared sense of desperation, Elara managed to exchange a few whispered words with Thomas as they scoured a particularly monstrous cauldron caked with burnt stew. "He suspects us both," Thomas rasped, his voice punctuated by his racking cough. "He thinks we know something. Or that we took it." But we did nothing, Elara whispered back, her eyes darting nervously towards the scullery door. Thomas gave a short, humorless laugh that turned into another coughing fit. Since when did innocence protect the likes of us, Elara? Thorn needs a culprit. If he cannot find the locket, he will find a thief to parade before Lord Uhtred, and we are convenient. His words sent a fresh wave of cold fear through her. He was right. In Blackwood Castle, justice was a luxury reserved for the high-born. For servants, there was only blame and punishment. The locket, her secret, was no longer just a burden. It was a mortal danger. The castle, meanwhile, buzzed with preparations for the arrival of Brother Michael, the Benedictine herbalist from the nearby priory of St. Swithin. His visits, occurring a few times a year, were generally welcomed by the castle's inhabitants. He brought news from the wider world, remedies for common ailments, and a quiet, scholarly presence that was a stark contrast to Blackwood's often coarse and brutal atmosphere. Even cook Agnes treated Brother Michael with a degree of grudging respect. For he was knowledgeable in the ways of simples and cures, and his poultices had more than once eased the ache in her own rheumatic joints. For Elara, Brother Michael represented something more, a fleeting connection to a world beyond the castle walls, a world of learning and perhaps, kindness. He was one of the very few individuals of status who did not seem to look straight through her as if she were a part of the grimy stonework. His eyes, the pale, gentle blue of a winter sky, sometimes met hers with a fleeting expression of what she dared to interpret as compassion. When Brother Michael arrived, the usual kitchen frenzy abated somewhat. Cook Agnes, unusually subdued, allowed him to inspect her stores of dried herbs, occasionally asking his opinion on their freshness or efficacy. Elara was tasked with fetching him a bundle of dried feverfew from a high, dusty shelf in the still-room. As she carefully handed the fragrant herbs to him, her fingers, chapped and sore, brushed against his. The contact, brief as it was, seemed to spark a desperate courage within her. "Brother," she began, her voice so low it was almost lost in the kitchen's ambient clatter. She kept her eyes downcast, terrified of being overheard, of his reaction. "A hypothetical question, if I may." Brother Michael turned, his gaze calm and attentive. "Speak freely, child. If a person, a lowly person, were to find something of value, something lost, and they feared greatly the consequences of being found with it, how might such a person ensure its safe return to its rightful owner, without bringing ruin upon themselves?" He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Elara's heart hammered. Had she said too much, would he report her suspicions to Thorn? But when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle, devoid of accusation. "A thorny question indeed, child," he said, his gaze drifting towards the smoky rafters as if seeking wisdom there. "Discretion, as you know, is a shield for the vulnerable. Sometimes, the most direct path is fraught with the most peril. An item rediscovered in a place where its owner might naturally find it, or perhaps conveyed through an intermediary of unimpeachable character who would ask no troublesome questions. These are avenues that have been known to yield good fruit. But timing, and the choice of method, are paramount. And one must always consider the nature of the owner. Some hearts are inclined to forgiveness, while others seek only a target for their wrath." He paused, then met her gaze directly. "Pray for guidance, child. And act with both caution and courage." His words, though veiled, offered a sliver of hope, a possible path through the thorns of her dilemma. An intermediary, a place of discovery, a seed of a plan, fragile and terrifying, began to take root in Elara's mind. Current part characters, 6170. Total characters, 21912. The fragile hope Brother Michael's words had kindled in Alara was almost immediately doused by a fresh wave of Thorn's tyranny. His failure to unearth the locket had curdled his mood into a perpetual state of simmering rage, and he seemed determined to vent his frustrations on those least able to defend themselves. The scullery, and Alara and Thomas in particular, became his preferred arena. He would materialize from the shadows like a malevolent wraith, his presence instantly thickening the already oppressive atmosphere. He would find fault where none existed, a speck of rust on a newly scoured pan, a hint of moisture on a supposedly dry trencher. His punishments were petty but wearing, an extra hour of scrubbing in the bone-chilling damp after the other servants had retired. The denial of a meager bread ration, a stinging slap for a perceived look of insolence. One particularly bitter afternoon, after a relentless barrage of Thorn's criticisms, Alara felt something within her begin to fray. The constant fear, the gnawing hunger, the endless, thankless labor, it was all becoming too much to bear. She scrubbed at a soot-blackened spit-roasting rod, her movements jerky. Tears of sheer frustration welling in her eyes, blurring the grime into a watery haze. She thought of the locket, hidden behind the stone, its silver beauty a stark contrast to the ugliness of her life. It was no longer a treasure, however secret. It was a curse, a leaden weight dragging her down. Thomas, working beside her, noticed her distress. His usual coughing fit subsided, and he laid a surprisingly gentle hand on her trembling arm for a moment. "Easy, Alara," he murmured, his voice rough but not unkind. "Don't let him break you. That is what he wants." His touch, his words, were a small, unexpected anchor in the storm of her emotions. She blinked back the tears, taking a shaky breath. He was right. She could not let Thorn win. She had to find a way out of this. Brother Michael's advice replayed in her mind. Timing, and the choice of method, are paramount. The castle was already abuzz with preparations for the upcoming feast to honor the arrival of Baron Fitzwalter, a powerful and influential kinsman of Lord Uhtred. Such events, Alara knew from bitter experience, threw the entire household into a state of controlled chaos. The kitchens would be a veritable inferno of activity, the staff stretched to their limits, tempers frayed, and the usual rigid routines momentarily disrupted. Similar to Source 77, 78, it would be a time of increased scrutiny, yes, but also, perhaps, a time of opportunity. A time when a small, insignificant scullery maid might be able to move through the castle's arteries unnoticed, shielded by the general bedlam. A desperate plan began to solidify in Alara's mind, a plan so fraught with risk that it made her stomach churn with a fear that was almost exhilarating. She would use the feast. She would find a way to return the locket to Lady Annalise's chambers, to leave it where it could be discovered. It was a wild, improbable scheme, but the alternative, waiting for Thorn to inevitably uncover her secret, or to choose her or Thomas as his scapegoat, was even more terrifying. She began to study the movements of Matilda, Lady Annalise's personal maid, with a new, focused intensity. Matilda was a young woman not much older than Alara herself. Perpetually harried, her arms always laden with bundles of linen, ewers of water, or trays of food. Alara noted the times Matilda was most likely to be in her mistress's chambers, the route she took through the service passages, the brief moments when she might leave a door ajar or a basket unattended. Every detail was hoarded, analyzed, woven into the fabric of Alara's desperate gamble. Thomas, observing Alara's furtive watchfulness and the new, almost feverish gleam in her eyes, grew increasingly concerned. "What are you plotting, Alara?" he asked one evening, as they shared a stolen moment of respite in the chill of the deserted scullery. "You have that look. The look of a rabbit contemplating a wolf's den." Alara hesitated. Could she trust him? Thorn's earlier accusation that they were somehow in league, though false, had forged a strange, unspoken bond between them. And Thomas had suffered because of her secret, however unknowingly. She owed him the truth. Or at least, a part of it. "I have to return it, Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drip of the leaky roof. "The locket. I can't. I can't keep it any longer. Thorn. He will destroy us both." Thomas's eyes widened, his already pale face growing even paler in the gloom. "You found it, Elara, by the saints, where?" She shook her head, unwilling to divulge her hiding place even to him. "It does not matter where. All that matters is returning it. And the feast. The feast is my only chance." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression a mixture of fear and a dawning, reluctant admiration. "You are mad," he finally breathed. "Utterly mad. If Thorn catches you. If I do nothing, he will catch us anyway," Elara said, a new, steely resolve hardening her voice. "This way. At least there is a chance." Thomas was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the damp stone floor. Then, he looked up, and Elara saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a flicker of defiance, a spark of shared rebellion. "All right, Elara," he said, his voice low and firm. "If you are set on this path, then tell me. What do you need me to do?" His words, his unexpected offer of alliance, sent a wave of warmth through Elara, a feeling so potent it almost brought tears to her eyes. She was not entirely alone in this. Current part characters, 5483. Total characters, 27395. The day of Baron Fitzwalter's arrival dawned with a flurry of activity that permeated every corner of Blackwood Castle, from the highest turret to the deepest scullery. The great hall, usually a cavernous, echoing space, was being transformed with surprising speed. Servants scurried to lay fresh rushes, their sweet, hay-like scent a temporary mask for the underlying odors of old stone and generations of spilled wine. Tapestries, depicting heroic, if somewhat moth-eaten, scenes of Uhtred ancestors vanquishing improbable beasts and even more improbable foes, were being unfurled and hung, their faded grandeur a testament to glories long past. The stables, already crowded, now overflowed with the entourage of the Baron. A cacophony of neighing horses, shouting grooms, and the metallic clang of farriers at work. And the kitchens. The kitchens had become a veritable crucible, a swirling vortex of heat, noise, and frantic energy. Similar to Source 78 cook Agnes, her face a roadmap of flushed determination, seemed to possess the demonic ability to be in three places at once, her voice, amplified by the urgency of the occasion. A constant, booming counterpoint to the rhythmic chop-chop-chop of cleavers, the sizzle of roasting meats, and the clatter of 1,000 pots and pans. Extra help. Culled from the village, wide-eyed girls and clumsy boys who mostly got in the way, only added to the prevailing sense of controlled pandemonium. The air itself was a thick, almost palpable stew of competing aromas, the rich, gamey scent of venison turning on the spit, the sweet perfume of spiced apples baking in the great ovens. The sharp tang of pickling vinegars, the earthy smell of root vegetables being scrubbed and chopped, all underpinned by the ever-present acrid bite of wood smoke and the collective perspiration of a dozen overworked bodies. Elara, caught in this maelstrom, felt a strange mixture of heightened anxiety and a perverse sense of calm. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, yet her mind was surprisingly clear, focused on the task ahead. The locket, carefully wrapped in its small scrap of rag, was a cold, hard knot tucked deep within the inner seam of her kirtle's sleeve. A constant reminder of the desperate gamble she was about to undertake. Under Steward Thorn, predictably, was in his element. Dressed in a tunic of slightly better quality than usual, its color a rather bilious shade of green, he bustled about with an air of officious self-importance. ostensibly supervising the flow of provisions and ensuring the smooth running of the preparations, but in reality, achieving little more than obstructing the already frantic efforts of the kitchen staff and delivering a stream of unhelpful criticisms. He cast several pointed, suspicious glares in Alara's direction, his small eyes narrowed, the wart beside his nostril twitching with a life of its own. But the sheer, overwhelming scale of the day's operations meant that even his targeted malevolence was somewhat diluted, lost in the general frenzy. This, Alara knew, was her best, perhaps her only, opportunity. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, and the first, most distinguished members of Baron Fitzwalter's party began to arrive at the castle gates, heralded by a flourish of off-key trumpets, the chaos in the kitchens escalated to a near fever pitch. Mountains of food were being plated, sauces were being lovingly or in some cases, desperately ladled, and intricate or at least, ambitious garnishes were being applied with trembling hands. Alara, assigned the Sisyphean task of scrubbing an Everest of pewter platters required for the endless succession of courses, kept her eyes darting towards the narrow passage that led, circuitously, towards the south wing and Lady Annalise's chambers. She knew, from her careful observations, that Matilda, the lady's maid, would soon be making a final trip to ensure her mistress had everything she needed, fresh linens, warmed water, a final adjustment to her elaborate coiffure, before the great feast commenced. Her chance, when it came, arrived on the back of cook Agnes's explosive temper. A delicate spun sugar sculpture, intended as the centerpiece for the high table, had catastrophically collapsed into a sticky, glittering ruin. Cook Agnes, her face the color of a ripe plum, let out a roar of pure fury that momentarily silenced even the spit boys. "Alara, girl," she shrieked, her eyes landing on the nearest available scapegoat. "You stand there gaping like a landed fish, make yourself useful, to the still room with you. Fetch more candied violets, and be back before I count to 10, or I will have your hide for a pot rag." The still room, as cook Agnes well knew, was in entirely the opposite direction to Lady Annalise's chambers. But the order, born of pure, unadulterated rage, was Alara's passport out of the scullery's immediate confines. "Yes, cook," she mumbled, wiping her greasy hands on her already stained apron, her heart giving a sudden, powerful leap. She bobbed a hasty curtsy and fled, not towards the still room, but towards the shadows, and her destiny. Current part characters, 5172. Total characters, 32567. Alara did not dare breathe until she was well clear of the kitchen's immediate orbit. Her soft, worn shoes, a legacy from a deceased laundry maid, making barely a whisper on the cold, uneven flagstones of the service passage. The air here was noticeably cooler, carrying the faint, musty scent of damp stone, old rushes, and something else, something indefinable, the ancient, sleeping breath of Blackwood Castle itself. The cacophony of the kitchens faded. Behind her, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed to press against her eardrums, an occasional scurrying sound in the wainscoting, the furtive rustle of a rat, was the only punctuation in the tomb-like quiet. Her hand instinctively went to the small, hard bulge in her sleeve. The locket. Its presence was a source of both terror and a strange, exhilarating resolve. She knew this passage well. A narrow, twisting artery in the castle's complex circulatory system, used primarily by the lowest servants on their thankless errands. It was rarely traversed by anyone of consequence, and thus, hopefully, a safer route than the more public corridors. It eventually intersected, she knew, with the slightly grander, though still unadorned, passage that led to the guest chambers in the coveted south wing, where Lady Annalise was lodged. Dust motes, disturbed by her passage, danced like frantic sprites in the thin, watery shafts of light that filtered through the occasional grime-encrusted arrow-slit window. Each creak of the castle's ancient, overburdened timbers, each distant, unidentifiable sound, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She pictured Thorn, his mean, pinched face, his eyes like beads of jet. Had he seen her leave, was his suspicious mind already piecing together her deviation from Cook Agnes's orders? The thought spurred her onward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She reached the T-junction where her humble service passage met the corridor leading to the south wing. She paused, flattening herself against the cold, damp stone wall, and peered cautiously around the corner. The corridor, wider here, and hung with a couple of threadbare, though undeniably noble, tapestries depicting faded hunting scenes, was blessedly, miraculously, empty. At the far end, she could see the heavy, carved oak door of what she knew from Matilda's comings and goings, to be Lady Annalise's suite. It seemed a mile away. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stepped out into the relative openness of the corridor. Her shoes, usually so quiet, seemed to echo unnaturally on these slightly more polished stones. Halfway to her destination, her eyes fixed on that imposing oak door as if it were the gates of paradise, or perdition, a voice, smooth as poisoned honey, sliced through the stillness. "Well, well, what have we here? A little scullery mouse, it seems, has lost her way." Or perhaps, the voice drawled, laden with a chilling amusement, she is precisely where she intends to be. Elara froze mid-stride, her blood turning to a slush of pure, unadulterated ice. Thorn. He materialized from the deep shadows of a recessed doorway, almost directly in her path. His arms crossed, a predatory smile playing on his thin, cruel lips. The wart beside his nostril seemed to twitch in triumphant anticipation. He had been waiting. Or perhaps, his luck, and hers, was simply that malevolent. "Are you seeking new employment, girl?" he purred, his eyes, small and glittering, raking over her from head to toe, making her feel stripped bare, exposed. "Perhaps as a lady's maid. Though I fear your aroma might prove somewhat unsuitable." He took a slow, deliberate step towards her. Elara instinctively recoiled, her back pressing against the cold, unyielding stone of the corridor wall. I was sent. Cook Agnes." She stammered, her voice a reed in the wind, the lie flimsy and transparent even to her own ears. Thorn's smile widened, a rictus of contempt. "Cook Agnes sent you to Lady Annalise's private chambers, did she now? How very thoughtful of her. Perhaps you have a message for the lady, or perhaps a small token, something she has been missing." His gaze flicked pointedly to her left sleeve, where her hand, despite her best efforts, had tightened convulsively over the hidden locket. He knew. Or if he did not know, he suspected enough to make her life a living hell. He took another step, closing the distance between them. Elara could smell the stale wine on his breath, the faint, unpleasant odor of his self-importance. There was no escape. The corridor was a trap, and he was the patient, venomous spider at its center. Current part characters, 4685. Total characters, 37252. He lunged then, not with the brute force he might use on a stable boy, but with a swift, snake-like dart of his hand, aimed directly at her left arm, the arm that concealed the locket. "Let us see what secrets our little kitchen rat is hoarding, shall we?" he hissed, his eyes glittering with malice. A choked cry escaped Elara's lips. Pure, unthinking terror, the primal instinct of a cornered animal, lent her an agility she did not know she possessed. She twisted violently, ducking beneath his grasping fingers, her small stature for once an advantage. His nails scraped her sleeve, missing their purchase by a hair's breadth. And then she was running, her heart a wild, panicked drum, back the way she had come, towards the only sanctuary she could imagine, the chaotic, crowded labyrinth of the kitchens. "Stop, you thieving slut!" Thorn's roar echoed behind her, a wave of pure fury. Stop, or by God, I will have you flayed alive. The chase was desperate, a blur of terror and adrenaline. Ilara's breath sawed in her lungs, her legs burned, but the sound of Thorn's heavier, enraged footsteps pounding the flagstones behind her, his curses defiling the air, propelled her onward. She knew these back passages, these forgotten veins of the castle, like the lines on her own calloused palm. She dodged around stacks of empty barrels, squeezed through narrow archways, her only thought to reach the relative anonymity of the kitchen's swirling chaos. If she could just make it there, she might have a chance, a sliver of a hope. She burst through the low doorway that led back into the main kitchen thoroughfare, a disheveled, gasping apparition. Her sudden, frantic entrance, her wild eyes and heaving chest, brought a momentary lull in the surrounding bedlam. Several pairs of eyes, startled scullions, bewildered undercooks, even one of the imperious spit boys, turned towards her. And then Thorn was there, framed in the doorway behind her, his face a mask of apoplectic rage, his usually sallow complexion flushed a dangerous, mottled purple. "Seize her," he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury, pointing a trembling finger at Ilara. "She is a thief, she has stolen from Lady Annalise, she has the locket." Cook Agnes, her face like a thundercloud, her hands planted firmly on her ample hips, a dripping ladle still clutched in one fist like a scepter of greasy authority, turned her formidable gaze from Ilara to Thorn. "Thorn, what in the name of all the saints is this caterwauling? Have you taken leave of your senses? Can you not see we are in the midst of serving a baron's feast? There is no time for your theatrics." But Thorn was beyond reason, beyond any concern for the feast or Cook Agnes's wrath. His eyes, burning with a vindictive fire, were fixed solely on Ilara. "She has it, I tell you, the locket, I saw her, skulking like a rat near the lady's chambers, search her." It was in that moment, as Thorn advanced on Ilara, his men-at-arms pushing through the throng of kitchen staff behind him, that Thomas acted. Thomas, who had witnessed Ilara's earlier, almost feverish agitation, who had seen the predatory gleam in Thorn's eyes whenever he looked at her, and who now saw the sheer, naked terror on her face. Perhaps it was a spark of loyalty, a flicker of defiance against their shared oppressor, or simply the desperate courage of a man with nothing left to lose. With a sudden, seemingly uncoordinated lurch, as if his worn-out boots had slipped on a patch of spilled grease, he collided heavily with a tall, precariously balanced stack of heavy pewter serving platters, dishes that had been painstakingly polished and were awaiting their burden of roasted meats. Similar to Source 53. The ensuing crash was cataclysmic. Platters, like a shower of silver shields, flew in all directions, striking the stone floor with a deafening, reverberating clang that momentarily drowned out even Cook Agnes's formidable voice. A nearby tureen of rich, dark gravy, jolted by the impact, overturned with a sickening slosh, its contents erupting in a wide, viscous wave that coated the surrounding flagstones and splattered the aprons of several unfortunate undercooks. Chaos erupted. Shrieks, curses, and the renewed, even more furious bellows of "Cook Agnes, my platters, my gravy, you thrice damned, clumsy, addle-pated son of a scabby goat," filled the air. Similar to Source 53, 78. Thorn, his men-at-arms, and indeed, every soul in the kitchen, were, for a crucial handful of seconds, entirely distracted, their attention ripped away from Ilara and drawn to the epicenter of this new, spectacular disaster. It was the briefest of windows, a chaotic, gravy-spattered interlude in the unfolding drama. But for Ilara, it was everything. Current part characters, 5075. Total characters, 42327. She did not waste a microsecond. While all eyes, including Thorn's momentarily bewildered ones, were fixed on Thomas and the magnificent ruin of the serving platters, Ilara moved. She was a shadow. A whisper, a creature born of the castle's neglected corners. She darted, not towards the exit, but deeper into the kitchen's labyrinth, towards a small, cluttered alcove she knew served as a temporary staging post for the laundry maids when they delivered fresh linens to the upper chambers. Her heart was a wild thing, threatening to burst from her chest, but her mind was icily clear. There it was, a large wicker basket, half filled with neatly folded chemises, shifts, and fine linen towels, all bearing the faint, clean scent of lavender and sunshine. A scent utterly alien to the scullery's perpetual miasma. This basket, she knew from her earlier observations, was destined for Lady Annalise's chambers, to be delivered by Matilda. With fingers that trembled so violently she could barely control them, Elara fumbled in her sleeve for the small, rag-wrapped package. She unwrapped the locket, its silver surface catching a stray gleam from a distant torch, cool and heavy in her sweating palm. For a fleeting, heart-stopping instant, she held it, this beautiful, accursed thing that had caused her so much terror. Then, taking a deep, ragged breath, she plunged it deep into the basket, burying it amongst the soft folds of a delicate linen chemise, pushing it down, until it was completely concealed. She smoothed the fabric over it, her touch feather-light. Just as she straightened up, melting back into the deeper shadows behind a rack of hanging game birds, their glazed eyes seeming to watch her with silent complicity, Matilda, Lady Annalise's maid, bustled into the alcove, her face a mask of harried concern. "Saints preserve us, what is that infernal racket?" Matilda muttered to herself, apparently oblivious to Elara's almost invisible presence. She added a small, embroidered pouch containing what looked like perfumed soap to the basket, hoisted it onto her hip, and with a sigh of exasperation at the continuing uproar from the main kitchen, hurried off towards the south wing. Elara sagged against the cold stone wall, her legs feeling like water, her entire body shaking with reaction. She had done it. The locket was gone, on its way back to its owner. Or at least, into her chambers. She was still in mortal danger. Thorn's fury would not be easily appeased, but the immediate, crushing weight of the locket's possession had been lifted. A strange, almost hysterical lightness filled her. She had faced the wolf, and for now, at least, she had escaped its jaws. And Thomas. Dear, brave, foolish Thomas. He had bought her that escape. With his own flesh and blood, with his own suffering. The thought was a fresh stab of guilt, quickly followed by a surge of profound, overwhelming gratitude. The immediate aftermath in the kitchen was a maelstrom of recrimination and frantic activity. Cook Agnes, her face a mottled purple, was alternately screaming at Thomas, who was on his hands and knees amidst the debris, trying to salvage what he could of the ruined platters and the spreading lake of gravy, and attempting to direct the remaining, demoralized kitchen staff to repair the damage and get the feast back on some semblance of schedule. Thorn, his initial distraction overcome, quickly remembered his prey. He stormed back towards Elara, who had managed to make her way, unnoticed, back to the relative anonymity of her scullery station. He grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh like iron talons. "Where is it, girl?" he snarled, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and foul. "What did you do with it?" Elara met his gaze, her own eyes wide with a carefully feigned innocence and terror. I do not know what you mean, under steward," she stammered, allowing her voice to tremble. "The locket, I never saw it. I was just. Cook sent me for time." He shook her violently. "Liar, I saw you, you were trying to flee." "She was fetching time, as I bid her," Cook Agnes suddenly boomed, appearing beside them like an avenging, gravy-stained fury. Her patience with Thorn, never abundant, had clearly been exhausted by Thomas's disastrous intervention. "And if my kitchen is to be turned into a bear pit by your inquisitions, Thorn, then Baron Fitzwalter can dine on cold scraps and apologies. Now, unhand the girl and let her get back to her work, unless you intend to scrub these 50 greasy trenchers yourself. Thorn, faced with Cook Agnes in full battle mode, and with no actual proof against Alara, no locket had been found on her person, and her story, however flimsy, was corroborated by the cook's immediate need for time, was forced to release his grip. He did so with an ill grace, his eyes still burning with suspicion and thwarted malice. "This is not over, girl," he hissed, his voice a low promise of future retribution. "Not by a long shot." He then turned his attention to Thomas, who was being hauled to his feet by two other scullions. "As for you, you clumsy, destructive oaf," Thorn spat, "you will pay for this. Every last dented platter, every spilled drop of gravy. You will work until your miserable hide wears thin." He then stormed off, ostensibly to report the kitchen's chaos to the head steward, but more likely to nurse his wounded pride and plot his revenge. Alara watched him go. Her heart still pounding, but a tiny, defiant spark of triumph flickering within her. She had survived. For now. Current part characters, 5718. Total characters, 48045. Later that evening, long after the crescendo of the feast had subsided into the drunken snores of sated nobles and the weary clatter of servants clearing away the debris, word trickled down to the lower echelons of Blackwood Castle. Lady Annalise's locket had been found. Miraculously. Her maid, Matilda, had discovered it nestled amongst a pile of freshly laundered chemises as she was preparing her mistress for bed. Such a fortunate happenstance, Lady Annalise was, of course, overjoyed, her delicate sensibilities soothed. Lord Uhtred, vastly relieved that this irritating domestic disruption was finally at an end, was said to have made a rather florid speech at the tail end of the feast, extolling the virtues of honesty and diligence amongst his household staff, and even, in a fit of uncharacteristic generosity, decreed an extra ration of ale for all servants below the salt. This pronouncement was met with the requisite chorus of sycophantic cheers from those nobles still conscious enough to register it, and a more muted, though no less heartfelt, murmur of approval from the exhausted servants. Under Steward Thorn, naturally, wasted no time in attempting to claim this happy outcome as a direct result of his own tireless efforts. He insinuated loudly, to anyone who would listen and to many who would rather not, that his relentless investigation, his unwavering pursuit of justice, had clearly put such pressure on the misguided individual who had temporarily misplaced the locket that they had been forced to return it, albeit discreetly. Few in the kitchens, who had witnessed his earlier impotent rage and his clear suspicion of Alara, gave his pronouncements much credence. But none, of course, dared to voice their skepticism aloud. Thorn's eyes, however, when they fell upon Alara during his subsequent pronouncements, were still filled with a cold, speculative light. He knew, or at least, he strongly suspected, her involvement. And Thorn was not a man to forget, or to forgive a perceived slight. For Thomas, the repercussions of his accident were swift and harsh. Cook Agnes, while perhaps possessing a shrewd understanding of the true motivations behind his sudden clumsiness, could not allow such a public and costly disruption to go unpunished, lest her authority in the kitchen be undermined. Thomas was therefore sentenced to a full night of the most unpleasant and back-breaking tasks the scullery and its environs had to offer. Scouring the charnel tubs where the animal carcasses were butchered, cleaning out the ancient, eternally blocked grease traps beneath the main kitchen floor, and hauling endless buckets of noxious refuse from the overflowing privies of the noble guest wing. These were jobs usually reserved for the most junior and expendable stable hands, or for those undergoing severe punishment. Alara, her heart a heavy stone of guilt and gratitude, did what little she could to alleviate his suffering. When Cook Agnes's attention was elsewhere, and Thorn was not prowling the lower corridors, she would surreptitiously help Thomas with his foulest tasks, scrubbing alongside him in the pre-dawn chill or the late-night gloom, their shared labor a silent testament to their unspoken alliance. He accepted her help with his customary stoicism, his thin face pale and drawn, his cough more pronounced than ever. But sometimes, when their shoulders brushed in the cramped, foul-smelling spaces, or when she managed to sneak him an extra crust of bread or a bruised apple, a fleeting ghost of a smile would touch his chapped lips, a silent acknowledgement of their shared secret, their shared survival. The feast, with its attendant dramas and disruptions, eventually faded into the castle's collective memory, replaced by the relentless, grinding rhythm of everyday existence. Thorn, thwarted in his desire for a public unmasking of a thief, and lacking any concrete proof with which to directly accuse Alara, contented himself with a campaign of petty, insidious harassment. He would accidentally trip her as she carried heavy buckets of water, causing her to stumble and spill their precious contents, earning her a sharp reprimand from cook Agnes. He would assign her impossible tasks with impossibly short deadlines, then berate her for her inevitable failure. He would simply stand and stare at her as she worked, his presence a constant, unnerving weight, his eyes filled with a cold, reptilian promise of future retribution. Alara bore these torments with an outward mask of quiet subservience, her face carefully schooled into the expression of blank invisibility that was the primary survival tool of Blackwood's underclass. But inside, a subtle alchemy was at work. Current part characters, 5244. Total characters, 53289. The fear, that cold, familiar companion, had not entirely vanished. It still coiled in the pit of her stomach whenever Thorn's shadow fell across her path, or when his sneering voice echoed down the stone corridors. But it was different now, subtly altered. It was no longer the absolute, paralyzing terror of a helpless victim. It was mingled with a new, unfamiliar sensation, a fragile but persistent ember of something that felt almost like strength. She had faced Thorn, faced discovery, faced ruin, and she had, through a combination of desperation, luck, and Thomas's selfless courage, survived. She had taken a risk, a monumental risk, and she had, in her own small, almost invisible way, triumphed. The knowledge of that, the memory of her own agency in a world designed to strip her of it, was a secret wellspring of resilience. The silver locket, the catalyst for so much turmoil, was gone, restored to its privileged owner. Alara would likely never see it, or anything like it, again. It belonged to a world of silks and velvets, of perfumed baths and leisurely pursuits, a world as distant and alien to her as the moon. Yet, its brief, illicit presence in her life had left an indelible mark. It had shown her that beauty could exist even amidst filth and despair, that even the most downtrodden could, in their own way, influence the currents of fate, however slightly. It had reminded her that she was more than just girl, more than just a pair of hands to scrub and haul. She was Alara. And she had acted. Weeks turned into a month, and the harsh northern winter, which had held Blackwood Castle in its icy grip for what seemed like an eternity, began, at long last, to show signs of wearying. The biting winds that howled around the battlements softened, carrying the faint, damp scent of thawing earth. Patches of stubborn, determined green began to push their way through the muddy squalor of the courtyard. A lone robin, bold and bright, was spotted perched on the sill of the great hall window, its tentative song a fragile promise of warmer days to come. Life in the scullery, however, remained largely untouched by these seasonal shifts. The stone floors were still cold, the water in the buckets still icy, the work still endless, the evening pottage still thin and unsatisfying. Cook Agnes still bellowed, her temper as unpredictable as the March weather, and under Steward Thorn still lurked, his malice a constant, simmering threat. But for Alara, something fundamental had shifted. The world, seen through her observant gray eyes, looked subtly different. She still saw the grime, the injustice, the casual cruelty that was the daily bread of Blackwood servants. But she also saw other things now. She saw the way Thomas, despite his racking cough and Thorn's relentless persecution, would still find a moment to offer a younger, terrified scullion a word of gruff comfort or a surreptitious share of his own meager rations. She saw the way the old laundry women, their hands gnarled and twisted like ancient tree roots, would hum ancient, half-forgotten tunes as they beat the dirt from the castle's linens, their voices a low, resilient chorus against the backdrop of their toil. She saw the fleeting moments of shared laughter, quickly suppressed, when a pompous visiting knight slipped on a patch of ice in the courtyard, or when one of Lord Uhtred's prized hunting dogs disgraced itself in the middle of the freshly swept solar. These were small things, almost invisible to an uninterested eye, but to Alara, they were signs of an enduring spirit, a stubborn refusal to be entirely crushed by the weight of their servitude. Brother Michael paid another visit to the castle, his arrival less heralded this time, more a part of the quiet, seasonal rhythm of his duties. He came to the kitchens, as was his custom, to replenish his stock of herbs and to offer cook Agnes his learned opinion on the efficacy of her latest batch of cough syrup which, by all accounts, was more likely to induce coughing than to cure it. Alara, tasked with sorting a basket of freshly gathered dandelion roots, kept her head bowed, her hands busy, acutely aware of his presence. As he was preparing to leave, his saddlebags filled with bundles of dried rosemary, sage, and comfrey, he paused beside her. "The spring herbs will be particularly potent this year, I believe," he said, his voice low and gentle, ostensibly addressing the air around them. "The long winter often concentrates their virtues." He then looked directly at Alara, his pale blue eyes holding a flicker of that same quiet, unnerving understanding she had seen before. "Small things, Alara, often possess the greatest strength. Remember that." He offered her a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then he was gone, leaving Alara with a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen fires. Small things often possess the greatest strength. The words echoed in her mind, a counterpoint to Thorn's sneers and cook Agnes's shouts. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps her own small act of returning the locket, an act born of fear but also of a desperate desire for justice, had been a small thing, but it had changed her. It had forged a bond with Thomas, a bond of shared risk and mutual protection. That was stronger than any forged in fear or servitude. It had shown her that even in the deepest darkness, it was possible to light a tiny candle. Current part characters, 6200. Total characters, 59489. One evening, long after the castle had settled into the uneasy slumber of the night, Alara found herself unable to sleep. The dormitory was filled with the usual symphony of human misery, snores, coughs, whimpers, the occasional muttered prayer or curse. But tonight, Alara's mind was too active, her thoughts buzzing like trapped bees. She slipped from her pallet, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone, and made her way to the small, grime-encrusted arrow-slit window that was her only connection to the world outside. The moon, a sliver of pure, cold silver in the inky sky, cast a faint, ethereal glow over the castle courtyard. The wind had died down, and an almost unnatural stillness lay over Blackwood. In that moment, the castle seemed less a fortress of stone and oppression, and more a sleeping giant, its dreams filled with the echoes of centuries of joy and sorrow, cruelty and kindness. Alara leaned her forehead against the cold glass, her breath misting its surface. She thought of the locket, of its intricate beauty, of the fear it had instilled in her, and of the strange, unexpected strength she had found in dealing with it. She thought of Thomas, his loyalty, his sacrifice. She thought of Brother Michael's gentle words. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that while her life was still a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and injustice, it was not entirely devoid of color. There were threads of resilience, threads of solidarity, threads of a quiet, stubborn hope. They were fine threads, easily overlooked, but they were there. And it was up to her to find them, to nurture them, to weave them into a pattern of her own making, however humble, however small. The first, pale light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern sky, a promise of another day, another round of toil and endurance. Elara watched it, a new sense of resolve hardening within her. She was still Elara, the scullery maid of Blackwood Castle. But she was also more than that. She was a survivor. She was a keeper of secrets. She was a weaver of her own small, resilient destiny. And as she turned from the window, ready to face whatever the new day might bring, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. The ember, she knew, was still glowing. The weeks that followed saw a subtle but palpable shift in the atmosphere of Blackwood Scullery. Thorne's malice towards Elara and Thomas did not lessen. If anything, his inability to definitively prove their involvement in the Locket affair seemed to fuel his resentment. He continued his campaign of petty persecutions, his sneers and jibes a constant, unpleasant background noise to their daily labor. But Elara and Thomas faced him with a new, unspoken solidarity. They developed a silent system of warnings, of shared burdens, of mutual support. If Thorne assigned Elara an impossibly heavy load of firewood, Thomas would invariably find a pretext to be nearby, accidentally taking some of the weight. If Thomas's cough grew particularly violent, Elara would ensure a mug of watered ale, or even a precious spoonful of honey pilfered from Cook Agnes's private stash, found its way to him. These were small acts, almost invisible in the grand scheme of castle life, but they were acts of defiance, of humanity, in a world that sought to strip them of both. Cook Agnes, for her part, seemed to observe this subtle shift with a grudging, almost imperceptible tolerance. Perhaps she, too, harbored a deep-seated resentment of Thorne's officious interference in her domain. Or perhaps, in Elara and Thomas, she saw a reflection of her own younger self. A survivor who had learned to navigate the treacherous currents of servitude through cunning and resilience. Her voice was still a thunderclap, her spoon still swift to punish carelessness. But occasionally, Elara would catch a flicker of something akin to approval in the cook's sharp, bird-like eyes when she managed a particularly difficult task with quiet efficiency. Or when she saw Elara offering a moment of comfort to a younger, weeping scullion. The most significant change, however, was within Elara herself. The fear of Thorne, while still present, no longer held the same paralyzing power over her. She had faced him in her own way, and she had not broken. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. This newfound understanding gave her a quiet confidence. A sense of inner strength that radiated outwards in subtle ways. She held her head a little higher, her gaze a little steadier. She even found herself, on rare occasions, humming a snatch of an old folk tune her mother used to sing. Her voice soft and low, a melody of resilience in the heart of the scullery's cacophony. One blustery afternoon, as Elara was scrubbing a particularly stubborn layer of burnt-on grease from a massive iron stewpot, Thorne appeared in the scullery doorway, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. "Girl," he announced, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "Lord Uhtred has decided that the scullery is overstaffed. It seems your services are no longer required here." He paused, savoring her reaction. "You are to be reassigned to the privies. Effective immediately." Cleaning the noble privies was, by universal consensus, the foulest, most degrading job in all of Blackwood Castle, a task usually reserved for those undergoing the most severe forms of punishment. It was Thorne's ultimate act of petty revenge, his way of finally breaking her. Elara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The stench, the filth, the utter humiliation. But then, she met Thorn's triumphant gaze, and something within her solidified. She thought of the locket, of Thomas's sacrifice, of Brother Michael's words. Small things often possess the greatest strength. She straightened her aching back, her expression unreadable. "As you wish, under steward," she said, her voice quiet but surprisingly firm. She would not give him the satisfaction of her tears. Or her fear. She would face this, too, with whatever strength she could muster. As she turned to leave, Thomas stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "If Alara goes to the privies, under steward," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "then I go with her. The scullery can spare two, if it can spare one." Thorn stared at him, momentarily speechless, his smugness faltering. Cook Agnes, who had been observing the exchange from the depths of her kitchen, let out a sudden, explosive bark of laughter. "Well, now, Thorn," she boomed, wiping her greasy hands on her apron, a dangerous glint in her eye, "it seems you have a pair of volunteers for your sanitation project. Or perhaps," she continued, her voice dropping to a menacing growl, "you would prefer to reconsider your staffing arrangements. After all, a well-cleaned privy is one thing, but a poorly cooked baron's feast, due to a sudden and inexplicable shortage of scullery hands. That, I assure you, would be quite another matter entirely. And Lord Uhtred, as you know, has a particularly sensitive digestion." Thorn's face, caught between the cook's thinly veiled threat and the unexpected defiance of two mere scullions, contorted into a mask of impotent fury. He knew when he was beaten. At least for the moment. "Very well, cook," he snarled, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "Have it your way. This time." He shot a venomous glare at Alara and Thomas, then turned on his heel and stormed out of the scullery, the wart beside his nostril twitching like a trapped insect. Alara and Thomas looked at each other, a silent, profound understanding passing between them. They had faced him together, and together, they had, for now, prevailed. It was a small victory, a temporary reprieve, but it was a victory nonetheless. And in the grim, greasy confines of Blackwood scullery, small victories were a treasure beyond price. Alara knew their struggles were far from over. Thorn would not forget, and the castle's oppressive weight would continue to bear down on them. But now, they faced it not as isolated, cowering victims, but as allies, bound by a shared resilience, a shared hope. The ember was not just glowing. It was beginning, however faintly, to spread its warmth. Current part characters, 7,291. Total characters, 66780. Life in Blackwood Castle, however, had a way of grinding down even the most resilient spirits, of extinguishing the brightest embers with the relentless damp of its despair. The small victory over Thorn concerning the privy duty proved to be just that, small, and temporary. Thorn, his pride wounded, his malice sharpened, found other, more insidious ways to make Alara's and Thomas's lives a misery. He could not directly countermand Cook Agnes's authority within her own kitchen, but his influence extended to other areas of the castle's lower workings. He saw to it that their already meager rations were further reduced, that the firewood allotted to their small, shared dormitory hearth was consistently damp and smoky, that their names were always at the top of the list for the most unpleasant, back-breaking tasks outside the scullery's immediate purview, hauling ice from the frozen river, in the depths of winter, turning the massive, creaking wheel of the castle's grain mill for hours on end, or assisting the gong farmers with their grim, nocturnal labors in the overflowing cesspits. Thomas's cough, a constant, rattling accompaniment to their days, worsened with each passing week. The damp chill of the dormitory, the poor food, the endless, exhausting labor, it was a recipe for decline. And Alara watched with a growing sense of helpless dread as his already thin frame grew gaunter, his skin more translucent, the spark of defiance in his eyes dimming into a dull resignation. She did what she could, sharing her own inadequate portions of food, ensuring he had the slightly less tattered of their shared blankets, rubbing his back when the coughing fits became too violent. But it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a leaky bucket. The forces arrayed against them, poverty, disease, the castle's indifference, were too vast, too overwhelming. Cook Agnes, for all her bluster and occasional flashes of rough kindness, was ultimately a creature of the system, her own survival dependent on maintaining the kitchen's brutal efficiency. She could shield them from Thorne's direct interference within her domain, but she could not, or would not, intervene in matters beyond it. She would sometimes cast a worried, almost pitying glance at Thomas's worsening condition, perhaps leaving an extra spoonful of fat or a slightly larger piece of gristle in his pottage bowl, but these were small, inadequate gestures in the face of his inexorable decline. Brother Michael's visits became, for Elara, increasingly precious, fleeting moments of solace in a sea of hardship. He would always find a quiet moment to speak with her, his gentle words a balm to her bruised spirit. He taught her to identify a few common herbs that grew in the castle's neglected corners. Yarrow for staunching blood, plantain for soothing burns, willow bark for easing aches and fevers. He even, on one occasion, seeing the wistful way she looked at the ink-stained ledger he used to record his observations, gave her a small, worn nub of charcoal and a precious scrap of clean, if coarse, parchment. Knowledge, Elara, he had said, his eyes kind, is a light that no darkness can entirely extinguish. Nurture it, however small its flame. Elara treasured these gifts. In the rare, stolen moments of solitude, usually late at night when the dormitory was finally still, she would practice her letters by the faint, flickering light of a pilfered tallow dip, painstakingly copying the crude charcoal markings Brother Michael had shown her. It was a slow, laborious process, her fingers, clumsy and stiff from a day of scrubbing, struggling to control the charcoal. But with each hesitant stroke, she felt a sense of connection to a world beyond the grime and drudgery of Blackwood. A world of learning, of ideas, of possibilities. One blustery evening in late autumn, as a cold, sleeting rain lashed against the castle walls, Thomas collapsed. He had been unusually quiet all day, his face flushed with fever, his cough more violent than ever. As they were finishing the last of the evening's scouring, he simply crumpled to the scullery floor, a thin, rattling sigh escaping his lips. Elara rushed to his side, her heart lurching with a terrible premonition. His skin was burning hot to the touch, his breathing shallow and labored. Cook Agnes, her usual brusqueness momentarily replaced by a look of genuine concern, helped Elara carry him to his pallet in the dormitory. She even produced a relatively clean blanket and a mug of warmed, spiced wine, unheard of luxuries. But Elara knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was not enough. Thomas was gravely ill, his lungs, already weakened by years of neglect and hardship, finally succumbing to the castle's relentless assault. For 3 days and nights, Elara nursed him as best she could, spooning watery broth between his cracked lips, wiping the sweat from his brow, whispering words of comfort and encouragement she was not sure he could even hear. Brother Michael was away, visiting a distant monastery, and the castle's self-proclaimed physician, a drunken, incompetent barber-surgeon named Master Grick, merely glanced at Thomas, pronounced it a lung fever common to his station, and prescribed a bleeding, a remedy Elara instinctively knew would only hasten the inevitable. She refused, earning her a stream of curses from Grick and a worried frown from Cook Agnes. On the third night, as a mournful wind howled around the castle's eaves, Thomas's breathing grew fainter, raspier. He opened his eyes, his gaze surprisingly clear, and looked at Elara. A faint smile touched his lips. "Thank you, Elara," he whispered, his voice barely audible. For everything." He squeezed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong for a moment. Then, with a soft, shuddering sigh, he was still. The silence he left behind was vast, echoing, more profound than any scullery quiet. Elara sat beside him, her hand still clutching his, the tears she had held back for so long finally overflowing, hot and bitter, tracing pathways through the grime on her cheeks. Thomas, her friend, her ally, her fellow survivor, was gone. The castle had claimed another victim. Current part characters, 5899. Total characters, 72679. The days that followed Thomas's death were a blur of numb, mechanical toil for Elara. His absence from the scullery was a gaping wound, a constant, aching reminder of her loss. The other servants, after a few perfunctory expressions of sympathy, quickly returned to the pressing concerns of their own survival. Death, particularly among the lower orders, was a commonplace occurrence in Blackwood Castle, as unremarkable as a change in the weather. But for Elara, Thomas's passing was a profound and personal tragedy. He had been her anchor, her confidant. The only person in that vast, indifferent fortress who had truly seen her, who had shared her burdens without complaint. Under Steward Thorne, predictably, showed no such sentiment. If anything, he seemed to take a perverse satisfaction in Thomas's demise, as if it were a personal victory. He even had the audacity to suggest to cook Agnes that Thomas's inherent weakness and laziness had finally caught up with him, a comment that earned him a glare so venomous it could have curdled iron. Yet, even Thorne seemed to sense that Elara, in her grief, was perhaps too fragile a target for his usual torments, or perhaps he simply found less sport in baiting someone who no longer had the spirit to resist. For a time, he left her largely to her own misery, a small, unintended mercy for which Elara was too numb to be grateful. Brother Michael returned a se'nnight later, his gentle face etched with sorrow when Elara, her voice choked with unshed tears, recounted the news of Thomas's passing. He sat with her for a long while in a quiet corner of the castle's neglected herb garden, listening patiently as she spoke of Thomas's kindness, his quiet courage, his racking cough that had been the soundtrack to their shared servitude. He was a good soul, Elara, Brother Michael said softly when she had finished, his voice filled with a deep, resonant compassion. And his suffering is now at an end. Take comfort in that, if you can. And remember, child, that the bonds of friendship, the acts of kindness you shared, these things endure, even when life itself is fleeting. They are the true treasures, more precious than any silver locket. His words, though they could not erase her grief, offered a small measure of solace. She thought of the locket, the catalyst for so much fear and, paradoxically, for the forging of her bond with Thomas. It seemed a lifetime ago. The locket was long gone, restored to its noble owner. Its fate unknown and, to Elara, irrelevant. But the courage it had inadvertently awakened within her, the solidarity it had fostered between her and Thomas. These things remained. They were a part of her now, woven into the very fabric of her being. In the weeks and months that followed, Elara slowly, painstakingly, began to rebuild her shattered world. The scullery was still a place of endless, mind-numbing labor, the castle still a fortress of indifference and casual cruelty. But Elara was no longer the same timid, frightened girl who had stumbled upon a silver locket in the refuse heap. Grief had hollowed her, yes, but it had also tempered her. Like steel in a blacksmith's fire, she was stronger now, her resilience forged in the crucible of loss and hardship. She continued her clandestine studies with the charcoal and parchment Brother Michael had given her, her clumsy letters slowly transforming into recognizable words. She learned to read, not fluently, not with ease, but enough to decipher the simple labels on the herb jars in the still room, or the crudely scrawled notices sometimes posted by the steward in the castle courtyard. Each new word she mastered was a tiny victory, a small act of defiance against the ignorance and servitude that was supposed to be her lot. She also found herself, much to her own surprise, taking on Thomas's role as a protector, a confidant, for some of the younger, more vulnerable servants. She would share her meager rations with a homesick kitchen boy, offer a word of gruff comfort to a weeping laundry maid, even, on one memorable occasion, intervene when one of Thorne's thuggish men-at-arms was attempting to bully a terrified child who had accidentally spilled a bucket of water in his path. Her intervention earned her a stinging blow to the face, but also the stunned, grateful admiration of the child, and a grudging, almost respectful silence from the man-at-arms, who seemed momentarily taken aback by her unexpected defiance. She was still Alara, the scullery maid. She still scrubbed, and hauled, and endured. But she was also becoming something more. She was a reader of words, a keeper of memories, a quiet champion of the forgotten. The ember that had once flickered so precariously within her was now a steady, resilient flame, casting a small but defiant light in the oppressive darkness of Blackwood Castle. It was a light that Thorne, for all his malice, could not extinguish. It was the light of a spirit that, against all odds, refused to be broken. And Alara knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within her soul, that as long as that light burned, there was still hope. Not hope for a grand escape, perhaps, or for a life of ease and plenty. But hope for dignity. Hope for meaning. Hope for the enduring strength of the human heart, even in the deepest, darkest scullery. Current part characters, 5449. Total characters, 78128. The turning of the seasons brought little change to the relentless grind of Alara's existence, yet within her, a subtle transformation continued. The harsh winter eventually yielded to a reluctant spring, the frozen earth of Blackwood's courtyard softening, grudgingly sprouting meager patches of determined green. The longer days meant more work, as the castle stirred with renewed activity, but they also brought a little more light into the scullery's perpetual gloom, both literal and metaphorical. Alara found herself noticing small details. She had previously been too consumed by misery to register the intricate patterns of frost on the arrow-slit window on a cold morning, the surprisingly sweet scent of wild thyme crushed underfoot in the herb garden, the complex hierarchy and subtle alliances among the castle's stray cats. Her reading progressed slowly but steadily. Brother Michael, on his increasingly frequent visits, he seemed to find more and more reasons to consult with cook Agnes about the priory's own pickling and preserving needs, would often leave her small challenges, a simple verse from the Psalms, a recipe for a healing salve, a list of herbs and their properties, scrawled on scraps of parchment. Deciphering these became Alara's secret obsession, a window into a world of thought and knowledge that was a universe away from the endless cycle of greasy pots and congealed fat. Cook Agnes, surprisingly, seemed to turn a blind eye to Alara's clandestine studies. Perhaps she saw a spark of her own long-buried intelligence in the girl, or perhaps she simply recognized that a scullery maid who could read might, in some unforeseen way, prove useful. On one occasion, Alara even managed to correct a misread quantity on a delivery note for the steward, saving the castle a not insignificant sum on a shipment of overpriced wine, an act that earned her a surprised, almost respectful, grunt from the usually dismissive head cook, and a venomous glare from Thorne, who had, of course, been responsible for the initial error. Thorne's animosity remained a constant, a dull, throbbing ache in the background of Alara's life. He had not forgotten the locket, nor her perceived defiance. He continued his campaign of petty torments. But they seemed to have less and less effect on her. Alara had learned to navigate his malice with a weary skill, to anticipate his moves, to deflect his barbs with a quiet, almost unnerving composure. Her resilience seemed to infuriate him even more than her previous fear had. He could not understand this scullery maid who refused to be broken, who met his cruelty not with tears or supplication, but with a steady, unwavering gaze that held no fear. Only a profound, weary understanding of his own pathetic nature. One day, a new kitchen boy arrived, no older than 10, his face pale and pinched with hunger, his eyes wide with the terror of a snared rabbit. He reminded Alara so much of herself when she had first been thrust into the scullery's brutal embrace. He was clumsy, easily intimidated, and an immediate target for Thorn's casual cruelty. Alara found herself intervening, subtly at first, then more overtly, deflecting Thorn's attention. Taking the blame for the boy's mistakes, sharing her own meager rations with him, teaching him the scullery's harsh rules of survival. It was a role she had never envisioned for herself. This fierce, protective instinct, but it felt right. It felt necessary. "Why do you help me?" the boy, whose name was Pip, asked her one evening, his voice a tremulous whisper as they huddled for warmth near the dying embers of the scullery hearth. Alara looked at him, at his small, frightened face, and she saw not just herself, but Thomas, and all the other forgotten, ground-down souls who toiled in Blackwood's shadows. "Because, Pip," she said softly, her voice surprisingly gentle, "no one should have to face the darkness alone. We scullions. We must look out for each other. It is the only way." In that moment, Alara understood something profound. Her strength, her resilience, did not come from a desire for personal escape, or for revenge against Thorn. Or even from her secret pursuit of knowledge. It came from connection. It came from compassion. It came from the quiet, stubborn refusal to let the castle's cruelty extinguish the last vestiges of humanity within herself, or within those around her. The locket was a distant memory, a catalyst that had set her on an unexpected path. The true treasure, she now realized, was not the silver, nor the brief, illicit thrill of its possession. It was the strength she had found within herself, the bonds she had forged in the heart of adversity, the enduring light of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming darkness. And that, Alara knew, was a treasure that no under-steward, no lord, no fortress of stone and despair could ever take away from her. Her battle was far from over, her life still a daily struggle for survival. But she was no longer just surviving. She was, in her own quiet, determined way, prevailing. And for a scullery made in Blackwood Castle, that was nothing short of a miracle.